First of all, thank you, Professor Davis, for your longer history of intersectionality, because I think so many times we lose that this is exactly as you're saying, something that's has a long history of people trying to understand the complicated, unequal, violent world around us. And related to the term intersectionality, so many times we use it as class, gender, race, as equal groundings in terms of the experiences that we face. And even as you're talking, you mentioned that there's 8 men, largely white, 1 Mexican, who own half of the world's wealth. And I'm wondering, how do you see that as significant that there's 8 men, most of them white? Because to me, the question becomes a very important difference between class and race and gender, because the fact alone that people own half of the wealth and leave the majority of us disenfranchised is a question that I would say is a very different importance between them. So my question is largely, how do you see the root of racism and sexism as coming from capitalism and coming from the class society that privileges and allows for a minority, a tiny minority of people to own all of the wealth?
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Okay. I'll say a few words in response to your question, and I think Ibram probably will have a contribution as well. Of course, capitalism is often the elephant in the room that we don't talk about. And we like to use the term racial capitalism, and Ibram has already used that term, because if one looks at the history of the emergence and development of capitalism, it is so entangled with slavery and racism that we can't conceive of capitalism outside of that racialized context. But I'm wary of those who assume that somehow we can find the one answer, and that answer is capitalism. And all we have to do is get rid of capitalism, and all of the problems will have dissipated. Because the notion of intersectionality, as we use it, entails an understanding of a very kind of complex entanglement. And you can't separate racism from capitalism. You can't separate capitalism from misogyny. And so what it means is that as activists or as scholars, that we do our work recognizing that it is against the backdrop of this understanding of the interconnections and interrelationalities of these phenomena. And I think that we should work wherever we feel called to work. You know, we should do the activist work that is most exciting to us, recognizing there's a connection. If I decide that I want to focus primarily on prison issues, I'm not separating those issues from the larger question of capitalism. I'm not separating them from working against racism, working against misogyny. I think that our understanding, our way of apprehending, you know, what it is we want in terms of social justice, you know, has to be very much informed by this sense of the interconnections. And of course, we know that capitalism doesn't exist by itself. I mean, where are we going to find capitalism separate from all of these other things we've been talking about? Where are we going to find sexism or misogyny separate from racism? Recently I said, I thought about asking an audience a question about when women got the right to vote. And I said, when did women get the right to vote? When did women get the right to vote? When? 1920? How many of you think women got the right to vote in 1920? You know there's an issue here, huh? So you're reluctant to raise your hands. So what if we were to say that the majority of black women didn't get the vote until 1965? So I think what I'm suggesting is that we try to think in a deeper way, and we try to be aware of entangling a whole history. Our very way of thinking about our histories is informed by the racism, by the misogyny that we want to challenge. And if we acquire the habit of being open so that if someone says, well, that was racist of you, the response is not, but I'm not a racist. It's like, yeah, it probably was, because, how is it possible to live in a country like this and not be influenced by, racist ideology? All of us are. And I think that's one of the points that you make in your work.
Yeah, I mean, it's equivalent to talk about how if you grow up in a society where it's sort of constantly raining racist ideas on your head and you don't have an umbrella, to claim that you have never been wet in your life. It's just preposterous, right? And so I think that I'm speaking to what Professor Davis said. One of the first aspects of sort of being an anti-racist, which I'm sort of writing about for this next book, is confession, is accepting, is admitting. And in order to admit and confess, you have to be self-aware and recognize. But it's very difficult for people to do because we want to deny, like Trump, and then criticize Trump, even though we're just like Trump. And so I think that it's critical for us, if you're truly against Trump, you can't simultaneously do precisely what Trump did and essentially deny. As he says, I'll just deny, and people will believe me. And just very quickly to the question, I think that when you look at it historically, historians really sort of look at the emergence of capitalism between the mid-1400s and the mid-1600s, which we call like the long 15th century. That's also the
historian
period.
Joke.
I know.
You heard all the historian nerds in the audience.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's also the period in which you had the development of what became known as the transatlantic slave trade. And when you talk about the accumulation of capital, and of course, everybody think about a business. You have to what? Get money in order to start a business. Well, when you think of capitalism as a system, you have to accumulate capital. Well, the accumulation of capital was directly the result of the enslavement of African people. And then that enslavement of African people was an exclusive enslavement of African people, which distinguished it from previous forms of enslavement in which people were enslaving Slavs in Eastern Europe, they were enslaving other people from the Middle East, they were enslaving all types of people. But no, the Portuguese And then subsequent slave traders decided, no, we're going to exclusively slave trade in African people. We're going to create these racist policies. We're going to justify them by saying these people are beasts. And so literally, we have the capacity to enslave them because they were meant for enslavement. They're the cursed descendants of Ham. And so this is really the development of racism and the development of capitalism both emerge in the same period, and they cannot be disconnected. So actually, I don't know what you'll think about this term, but I have this one of the chapters in How to Be an Anti-Racist is on class, and I sort of talk about this relationship between racism and capitalism, and I identify them as the conjoined twins. So we can really understand, right? Because you have conjoined twins, the same body with different faces and personalities, right? And so and so I think that's another way to sort of understand how sort of entangled they are. But then you can't also recognize how entangled sexism is, and sexism predated both racism and capitalism, as did homophobia. And capitalists and racists used and reproduced and racialized sort of gendered and bodies for their own gain. I mean, I think y'all understand the point, right?
Yes.